thanks very much for inviting me today on a great cue as well. The bell rang just as I stepped on stage. This is such a great event and really close to my heart. I am a woman who is a scientist and has dedicated my career to climate change and particularly focusing on cities. So I'm really delighted to be here today. And when I was back at university, I received a very similar presentation to the one Neil gave today, and it really resonated with me and made me really devote my whole career to trying to tackle climate change. So I hope you've all felt as inspired. I still continue to feel inspired and certainly a little worried about all of the challenges we're facing. But I hope that today I can be able to explain to you why the focus on cities is important, how are cities leading on this issue, and what are some of the opportunities. So let me first tell you what C40 is. I work for an organisation called C40, a non-profit, and it's a network of mayors of the world's leading 100 cities. So it's mainly the mega cities all around the world. We have cities in every region, and they're mainly the ones that are really, really big, or some of the ones that are small, but really pushing the envelope in terms of climate ambition. But all of these mayors have committed to join C40 to be leaders on tackling climate change, to be political leaders, and to really take the urgent action that's needed now. Not only on climate change, but also ensuring that we end up improving equity, that we end up with economic prosperity, and many of those other kind of co-benefits that Neil just outlined for us. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the mayors of C40 cities are committed to using an inclusive but science-based and data-driven approach and truly collaborative approach to ensure that we limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. We will, and we are already facing the impact of climate change for 1.5 degrees, but C40 and the mayors that lead our organisation are one of the first big global organisations to say we can't even consider 2 degrees warming. We have to limit to 1.5. That's starting to become the consensus now, but C40 was really pushing that at the start and saying we can't start to think even about the consequences that we'll face at 2 degrees. Next slide, thank you. So why cities? It's what your competition is all about, so I think we'll just give a bit of context of why cities. They occupy only 2% of the world's landmass, but they consume around 75% of the world's energy. They create, are responsible for 70% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, and also generate over 80% of the world's GDP. So stuff really happens in cities. Things are really moving in cities, and we expect cities to grow and to increase in the coming years. Particularly, many of our cities in the global south are expected to grow significantly, and we've got to be aware and open to that challenge. We're looking at a growth by 2050 that is the equivalent of a city the size of Stockholm or Madrid kind of size, really being built every single week, looking out to 2050. So significant growth. Next slide, please. So they contribute to climate change. I've mentioned this already, but also cities are where the solutions lie. Cities are this hub of people, hub of consumers, if you like, but also decision makers, and they can be diverse and innovative. Cities are much more nimble and progressive than most nation states. So a large number of cities, C40 cities, have committed to action plans that will achieve or in compliance with 1.5 degrees. There is a tiny number of countries that have committed to the same level of ambition. So that ambition is really at home in cities. And also, they're able to move a bit quicker. You know what a city's like. We all probably live in cities, a number of you in London, but also other cities. And so you can get a real sense of what can and what can't change on a city scale. I've mentioned before, they're financial and economic hubs, and so they have political and economic weight, and they're led by dynamic mayors. We think we've got some pretty cool members of C40, but you often find very charismatic, ambitious mayors that have been elected who really are in tune with their residents and with their populations and really want to see immediate action and change within the city, within even their electoral cycle, which is normally around 4 to 5 years. They are advocates for a green and just recovery from COVID-19. So COVID-19 hit our cities very, very hard, not only in terms of impacts on health and economic hubs, but also in terms of lack of jobs, in terms of changing of dynamics, how the cities run, reduced use of public transport, more use of cars, some real big challenges kind of facing cities. And I think I've already mentioned that they're global leaders in the fight against the climate crisis. Next slide, please. Imagine a map, a global map, and we have these 96 member cities of C40, and they're all spread all around the map. But the important things to remember here is that we directly represent, with this membership of cities, 582 million residents. So the change from this group of 96 cities is incredibly significant in terms of the impact it will have. And we all know that a lot of people come and work in cities and move around within cities, even if they don't live in them. And so we have an indirect influence of 896 million cities. So this leadership of cities and the change they can make is really impactful. And I want you to keep that in mind for this competition, because I think it can really spur change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what cities are doing in order to adapt to climate change, so adapt to the impacts that we're currently facing. And then I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about some of the actions our cities are taking to mitigate climate change and reduce the emissions. So why do cities need to adapt to climate change? They've got high population densities and are often situated in strategic yet vulnerable locations. Many of you will have visited lots of cities. They're often by the coast. Sea level rise, they're therefore at high risk of flooding. We also see most vulnerable populations, those on the lowest incomes, their homes are always on the floodplain. Any city you go to, you will notice this is a common theme. It's the cheapest land, and therefore its most vulnerable people are put on in those locations. So that means as we start to see this increased frequency and impact from climate change, it's going to hit the vulnerable populations the most. In terms of heat waves, cities are hotter. You all will have experienced this as well. It's hotter in Westminster than it is if you go out to Zone 6 and you've got a bit more green space. And really, so therefore, heat waves are concentrated. All of the buildings around the city exacerbate this. You mentioned, Neil, the heat wave in Spain last week. I was in Madrid on Friday. It was 6:30 p.m. I was getting a bus, and the temperature on the bus stop said 38 degrees. Now, I'm from the northeast of England. I am not prepared for 38 degrees. I'm not sure many people are, but I was literally melting. But it shows, and everybody I met in Madrid said, maybe this is July weather, but it's definitely not May weather. It was a real shock to the system. So also in terms of numbers, hopefully you can see these. 650 million city residents will face water scarcity, but in 2050, we can't live without water. 1.6 billion city residents will face extreme heat by 2050, and 98% of our 100 cities, 96 cities at C40, have already faced severe climate threats. Next slide, please. A couple of examples of what some cities are doing about it. If you've ever been to Milan, this is the vertical forest. A new housing development has been built integrating nature-based solutions, which I'll talk about in a second. And this photo here is from Freetown in Sierra Leone, which is a very significant mudslide, if you can see that. And in Freetown, they've got this great slogan of Freetown the Tree Town. And so the mayor of Freetown has committed to plant 1 million trees by the end of 2022 to help prevent some of these further mudslides that are going to exist. And as you can see, there's a lot of people living very close to this mudslide, so the impact is significant. So this shows the need to really green our cities, the multiple benefits nature-based solutions can bring. They help us cool down, they provide shade, but they also cool the overall area. They help prevent flooding, they slow the kind of movement of water, which runs very fast off concrete, runs a bit slower through green spaces. They allow more kind of easier maintenance of water and ensuring that you can fill up your aquifers over time. And they help form a kind of natural barrier for sea level rise and coastal flooding. So these are really just a couple of examples of what cities are doing. Next slide, please. So on the reducing emissions to mitigate climate change, so we know we're already seeing our impacts. Our cities have to adapt to that. But of course, to achieve 1.5 degrees, we also need to significantly reduce the emissions from our cities. And so we're seeing as well health impacts that are associated with these emissions. 6.7 million premature deaths per year are due to poor air quality across C40 cities. 40% of the emissions come from our buildings, and we spend 90% of our time in or around buildings. And a third of all food produced across our 96 cities is wasted. And so think of the emissions impact of that food in the production, the transportation, and then the waste of that food. So these are some big challenges to face in terms of mitigating emissions. I'm going to do just the last slide, thank you. So a couple of examples of what cities are doing. I thought I'd give you a London example, seeing as we're right in the heart of London today. So some of you may know that recently London expanded its ultra-low emission zone, which is a vehicle restriction zone. So if you have an old vehicle in London, diesel, some older petrol vehicles, To bring it into central London, or within the North and South Circular, you have to pay £12.50 a day. So it's a restriction and a regulation on cars. This was introduced last year, and a year on, we're now seeing 47,000 fewer of these vehicles in the centre of London at this time. This is really significant in terms of the amount of stuff that's just chucked out the back of these tailpipes of the cars. And you may notice a difference. The taxis are a bit quieter. There's more electric and hybrid vehicles kind of driving past you as you're going through London. And another example from a different part of the world, in Bogota, in Colombia, they have now committed to only procuring zero-emission buses. So Bogota is a big city. They had a large number of diesel, highly polluting buses, and have transformed their bus fleet into only zero-emission buses. And if you go to many cities, have a look out for the side of the buses, and it will normally say zero emission or 100% electric now. It's really becoming the norm. And I think that's it. So I hope that I've given you some indication of why cities and why this is so important. Thanks very much.